Good evening, everybody. Well, it's the beginning of. Well, let me check what is the day of our course. That would be day 8. Day 8. So, 2 more days left. That's not bad. Tomorrow is going to be Thursday. And we'll be covering chapter 27, the 1960s. We have day 9 on Friday. And day 10 coming up on Tuesday. So the good news is there is Martin Luther King Day, and Martin Luther King comes exactly from this decade of the 1960s, at least that's when he was assassinated, and that's when the whole civil rights movement took place. So anyways, day 8, we have day 9 and day 10 coming up on Tuesday after MLK Day, and our final exam on Wednesday. So we are moving ahead. So let's see. We have, these are the multiple choice questions, but I need the IDs. The IDs for tomorrow, chapter 8, include number 1, Fidel Castro. Okay. Let me give you a short introduction to the decade of the 1960s. This is the decade when the baby boom generation comes to the fore. In other words, baby boom generation are the people who got married. Typically, it's considered, right? People who get married after World War II. So a young man was out during World War II. In 1945, he came back. In 1946, he got married. His wife got pregnant, and they had a child in 1946. That's a baby boom generation. That's when actually the baby boom occurred. It refers to the increased number of baby that was born in the 1940s and 50s. So these people came of age in the 1960s. So if that person was born in, I don't know, let's say 1946, imaginary Joe baby boomer, then he was 20 years old in 1666. So we have a lot of things going on in the world at this time. Something very unexpected, and that's decolonization. Great Britain, for example, went to war, World War II, not expecting that it would lose its empire. In fact, one of the main reasons for Great Britain, United Kingdom, to enter World War II was to defend the British Empire against the Germans. And supposedly they managed to do so, except that, soon parts of the so-called Third World, right? The Third World refers to, the First World was the Western world, the Second World was the Communist world, and the Third World was the rest of the world. That was the definition of the time. So you have India asking for independence. Actually, India was asking for independence even during World War II, which was very, very unpleasant for the British, because there was Chandra Bose, one of the leaders of the Indian independence movement, who actually went to Hitler, asked Hitler to help him out, free India from the British rule. So this was something that was fairly embarrassing for the British. And it takes away a lot from this simple picture of World War II as this, good versus evil struggle. So anyways, so India got its independence. immediately after World War II. In China, one of the reasons that the Communist Party of China won the Civil War was that the Republic of China, the so-called Free China, was considered in many ways as a puppet, especially of the American government, but both American and British government, the British were also involved in helping and propping up the Republic of China. So one of the main reasons that the Communist Party of China won and Mao Zedong won was that he represented an independent China outside of the influence of the great powers like United States and Great Britain. And this followed with a couple of examples that you had before. There was a coup in Egypt against the king of Egypt, who was considered to have been a British puppet. A group of young officers took over power in Egypt and wanted to take back the Suez Canal, the greatest treasure of Egypt, right? But the Suez Canal was the lifeline of the British Empire. It was actually built by the French, but later on it was bought by the British from the French. And actually, and there was some sort of issue of a joint ownership. There was a part of depending on the situation, number of shares that the government of Great Britain held as ownership of the canal. So that canal was the closest link between Europe and India, between Great Britain and India. And it had enormous impact. A couple of months ago, I think last year, there was I forgot the name of a container ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and people were freaking out immediately because whole traffic stopped in the canal, and that had enormous consequences on the world economy. The oil would stop flowing, all the transportation would just stop between Europe and Asia would just stop. It has to go across, around the Horn of Africa, down to South Africa and the Horn of Africa, and that's takes much longer time, and it's much more expensive. So, anyways, there were changes in the world that represented the end of colonialism. Colonialism and imperialism is something that started with Columbus, so everybody blames Columbus for it. And he sort of takes a symbolic punishment, not for actually what he did, but what happened after him, supposedly that he caused. Anyways, be that as it may. So, from the beginning of the 1500s, Europeans created colonies all over the world, and Great Britain turned out to be the largest colonial power. And in the 1960s, British colonies and French colonies and Dutch colonies and Portuguese colonies asked for independence. They didn't want to be ruled anymore by London or Paris or Lisbon in Portugal. So anyways, a similar thing happened in Cuba. Cuba was supposedly liberated from Spain in 1898 when the United States interfered in the conflict that was going on the island between the pro-Spanish and pro-independence forces. And one of those pro-independence forces was Jose Marti, who as everything in politics, there are always two sides to things, and what somebody sees as great, other side sees as awful. So, for example, Jose Marti, could be considered one of the great creators of Cuban independence. But for the people in Cuba who are pro-Spanish, and there were a lot of those, Jose Marti was American lackey, somebody who was paid by United States to steer trouble in the island and take away that island from Spanish rule. And so, you know, these were the debates that were going on in Spain and Cuba, and after you know, America sort of created an independent Cuba, and then stay on the island for a while, wrote a constitution, left the island, came back several times. U.S. Marines landed up in Cuba to interfere in local politics, and eventually, it actually, you can say that it never really left the island. And in the 1950s, the island of Cuba became a very, very shady place due to American influence, with a lot of shady business that couldn't go on here in New Jersey or New York or Connecticut would take place in Cuba. It was offshore, nobody knew what was going on, and you know, it could be done behind the scenes. So a lot of Cuban people blamed the whole corruption on their island, on the United States. And to a large extent they were right. What was happening was that Americans would buy politicians in Cuba who allowed them to do basically what they wanted on the island, at the detriment of the, you know, population that lived there. So Fidel Castro came to power then. There was a thing that was called the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro was in Mexico, in exile, and he and a couple of others, including famous revolutionary icon of the 60s, Che Guevara, crossed over the Gulf of Mexico on a boat from Mexico to Cuba, and landed in the south of Cuba and started a guerrilla war against the Eugenio Batista, who was a dictator of Cuba and American puppet. It's interesting that Eugenio Batista was had a little bit darker skin, so that was sort of an American creation. That supposedly at Cuba there was a lot of racial discrimination, white Cubans against brown Cubans. So anyways, you know, United States played that race card in Cuba. I say that because Fidel Castro was a pure castizo. He was, as they say in Spain, he was a pure Spanish origin. What we would call here mistakenly white. But anyways, be that as it may. Fidel Castro takes over the island and gets rid of the Americans. Lock, stock, and barrel. And all the American friends run away from the island and settle in Miami, or actually here, more. It wasn't so much in Miami, but you know, a lot of them did settle in Miami, but some of them settled in here in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, tri-state area. So anyways, the reason he's here is because of Kennedy and Cuban Missile Crisis. That's one of the big surprises, that people thought that, you know, under Eisenhower, the Cold War was going to get worse. That under Democratic administration, which is, you know, Democratic Party is naturally more left-leaning, then, you know, they would get along better with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which is also a left-leaning party. It turns out this was wrong. actually, Eisenhower was very reluctant to escalate during the Cold War. And even when provoked, and for example, Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, was, or you can say it was a Soviet provocation of the United States. It was the Soviets sort of pushed that space program through very, very quickly without any concern, of safeties or anything. Just if it flies, send it into space and let the Americans worry about the consequences. And the idea was to embarrass Eisenhower that America is lagging behind in terms of space technology, in terms of missile technology. Missile technology is probably more important than atomic bomb because it's the ballistic missiles that actually deliver atomic bombs, so that they make them effective. Otherwise, atomic bomb is a clunk of uranium and whatever you put it in, and how you drop it somewhere, right? That's the big problem. So anyways, with the invention of these rocket powered ballistic missiles, you can actually put an atomic bomb on it and send it wherever you want to Moscow, to St. Petersburg, or Leningrad, it was called at that time, and to China, you name it. You can threaten people with, in the same way that now you have a North Korean dictator is testing new kinds of missiles, hypersonic missiles, that he can drop pretty much anywhere he wants to. So Cold War gets it into a very, very interesting phase. There is this idealized picture of Kennedy, who, young and innocent, the youngest American president ever elected. And that's, more or less true. Except Kennedy got elected as a Cold War hawk, as a conservative Democrat. And a Cold War hawk. He accused Eisenhower's administration of being too soft towards the Soviet Union. And that, on the face of it sounds kind of ridiculous because, it doesn't get tougher than Ike. I mean, in terms of Eisenhower, the commander of Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. I mean, you can't really argue that, Eisenhower was a wobbly person. But that's what Kennedy attacked him, and that's how he got elected. That election was a squeaker, and a lot of people think that there was a lot of, let's say, irregular activities going on during those elections. In particular, the focus was on Chicago, and well, you know the story by now, a lot of dead people voting and so on and so forth. So anyways, we always get surprised when this happened as if it never happened in US history. And it happens every single time. It's just, they tell us that, well, it doesn't affect the outcome of elections. Well, okay, that's what it is. So, be that as it may, Richard Nixon, who was vice president again under Eisenhower, conceded the election, and he didn't want to push those disputes any further, like some other presidents have done so. Like, I don't know, Rutherford B. Hayes, things of that sort. So anyways, be that as it may, so Kennedy became president and took a very, very rough line towards the Soviet Union, and also tried to invade Cuba. that invasion, it's called the Bay of Pigs invasion, failed. And early in his administration, Kennedy had to, come in front of a nation and say, well, this was this was bad, and so that's that. Another very, very dangerous phase of the Cold War. Later on, Soviet missiles were found on Cuba. Photographs of Soviet missiles were found on Cuba. And Kennedy also made a big deal. It was a show program. One of the things, for example, that most people criticize is that a lot of these things during the Cold War were handled behind the scenes. In other words, you find missiles on Cuba, you go to the Soviets, you talk to them discreetly behind the scenes, and come make some sort of agreement, and nobody really knows about it. It doesn't leak to the press, and things of that sort. But this was not the policy of Kennedy administration. They went to the United Nations and publicized those photos, and sort of put themselves in a corner, because the Soviet answer to these allegations that yes, we have missiles in Cuba and you have ballistic missiles in Turkey. Turkey is right on the border of the Soviet Union, the same way that Cuba is right on the border of the United States. And it takes exactly the same time for a missile to reach from Cuba to reach Washington, D.C., as it takes a missile from Turkey to reach Moscow. So we are not doing anything that you guys are not doing already. That was the Soviet answer. So Kennedy upped the ante and declared the naval blockade of Cuba, which is a declaration of war. Strictly speaking, it was. So the Soviet ships were sailing towards Cuba, and the Americans ships were waiting for them to take them down. And at the last moment, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, backed down and told those Soviet ships to turn around. It was a great gamble on the part of Kennedy, and it's the gamble that he sort of, I'm not sure that he won or lost, because the agreement was, yes, Soviet Union will remove the missiles from Cuba, but United States will remove its missiles from Turkey. Except that part about United States removing missiles for Turkey was kept secret. So the Soviets also agreed to do it secretly without announcing it publicly. So it's one of those weird things of the Cold War that, I don't know, it might be a little bit hard to understand. Why was this going on? But there was electoral promise on the part of Kennedy. You can look at the space program also from the same point of view. Eisenhower thought that space program was a waste of money, and he didn't want to invest too much money into it. Kennedy, on the other hand, made it a promise that the United States would do better than the Soviet Union in space and put a man on the moon. And anyways, and then this crazy space game starts. Namely, first Soviet Union launches first artificial satellite Sputnik, and then there is Laika, the first dog in space. And that, anyways, I have a question for you. That little dog sort of was killed basically immediately as after launch in that space capsule. And then there was the first cosmonaut, or the first man in space, Gagarin. Yuri Gagarin was also a Soviet. So America was obviously lagging behind in this technology, and Eisenhower thought that it was unnecessary spending. But the Soviet Union thought that it's, it was a way to make fun of America and show that Soviet Union is a more advanced country than the United States. So they used that opportunity, and Kennedy responded in kind, and NASA was created, and Apollo program, and Americans were landing on the moon in a couple of years, and you name it. And so I don't know, just can't resist to tell a personal story. I was most of the space program actually was not happening in Houston or in Cape Canaveral, what's now Cape Kennedy down in Florida. Those were the launch site, and Houston was the headquarters of NASA. But actually, a good chunk of the program was in Alabama. And there's a huge space museum in Alabama, and you can see all these space capsules and Apollos, and what they used to send real people in space. And I remember my first impression was, I don't know, I wouldn't put my worst enemy into these things. They looked really, really shabby, at least from our 2022 perspective. Basically a tin can and put on a rocket and send over into space. But anyways, those were the times like that, so what can you do? We also have the issue of civil rights. The issue of civil rights, and there we have James Meredith, one of the icons of the civil rights movement. The issue in the South was, as you all know, we covered that stuff. Hopefully pretty well, and you will recall these Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws were introduced after the Reconstruction, after that election of Rutherford B. Hayes. So Democratic Party won control of the South, and they introduced those laws that limited access to black Republicans to voting and to being elected. And now this time around, it was not just an issue of right to vote, but also of educational facilities. They were segregated into black schools and white schools, into black universities and white universities. And James Meredith was one of those guys who wanted to go to the University of Mississippi and was not allowed to. So anyways, Strom Thurmond is an example of number two, right? James Meredith was number three. Strom Thurmond was number two. He was example of those people that were called Dixiecrats. Dixie means the South, Dixieland. And Dixiecrats are Southern Democrats. Dixie Democrats, Dixiecrats. And there were a lot of those around, including, well, our president, Joe Biden, started as one of them. Delaware, if you're not aware, is considered a southern state. It's south of the Mason-Dixon line. But George Wallace, that you had before, was also a Democrat for Alabama, who broke with both parties in this case, because there was a majority consensus, that among the Republicans and Democrats that this civil rights should be taken away. But these Southern Democrats were relentless, and George Wallace ran for president and won several states on this Dixiecrat platform. Strom Thurmond is one of those Democrats too who split with he's one of the few who actually became Republicans. So that's an interesting part of American politics that I would like you to have a look at. Have a look at the biography of Strom Thurmond, and see what you could conclude from there. Finally, we have number 4 and number 5, Joan Baez and Little Richard. The music of the 60s. And let's start with Little Richard, because that's a little bit easier to explain. Black music in America is extremely creative. And this was noted already in the 19th century when Dvorak, a European composer, visited New York and heard black music in the churches of Harlem. He said, wow, this is the future of American music. Pardon me. So, but there was a reluctance on the part of white Americans to accept black music as their own. And this was done, this sort of so let me put it this way: it's the story is very long and complicated, and you can get into all sorts of details. I just want to give you a 411 on the whole story. So rock and roll itself came from the blues, and it's based on blues patterns and blues harmonies and blues rhythms. And as rock and roll, it became a little bit more acceptable, but it was still played by black communities in the north, especially in Detroit, Motown, and Chicago. So Little Richard is one of those important figures of rock and roll where actually black musicians and entrepreneurs started selling this music, kind of a light version and happier version of the blues, to the white audience. And the culmination of this process was Elvis Presley, who really sold to white people the black music. So anyways, he was anyway, so that's a racial view of rock and roll history, and I would like you to have a look at that. And I don't know, I picked up a random example, Little Richard. I could have picked up several other people as an example, but let it be Little Richard and the beginnings of rock and roll. That continues also with the Rolling Stones, who heard this black music and imitated those blues music. Just 4 white guys from Great Britain who were trying to play the blues, and that's the Rolling Stones. So, anyways, that's one of the legacies of the '60s. And finally, we have Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, which represents the folk music of America, something that we would call country music, or at least, except it seems to me that if it's a Republican music now these days, then it's called country music. But if it's progressive music of these days, Democrat, then it's called a folk music. So anyway, it's silly things about politics. So yeah, Joan Baez was one of those activists and musicians of the 1960s. Anyways, I don't know what else else I can tell you about the 1960s. Let's have a look at, oh, this is something else. Let's have a look at the questions that I have for you here. Civil rights era, no, okay, right, that's we covered that. Cuba, Nixon and Kennedy, okay, Kennedy, right, that election, we talked about it. Cuba and Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, missile crisis, right, USSR space program, Sputnik, blah blah, Laika, the dog, poor little Laika. What happened to Laika? Check that out. I don't think it's in the book, but check it out on the web. You'll find it's a fascinating story. The space race, Cuban Missile Crisis, right. The beginning of the involvement in Vietnam. That's also one of the legacies of the Kennedy administration or Kennedy-Johnson administration. And it was a sign of big trouble for the United States. Vietnam War was one of the greatest disasters in American history, one of the greatest military defeats. Even though we, don't like talking about it as a defeat, but that's what it was. Basically, Vietnam was a French colony. The French wanted to keep it after World War II, and they tried to do so, and they were defeated. And the French left. And United States came in under the pretext of, well, there's a South Vietnam and they want to be a free country. North Vietnam, they want to be a communist country, so, we can't do much about it. But we can protect South Vietnam from the communist takeover. Most Vietnamese didn't buy that explanation, and they opted for the communist taking over and guaranteeing the independence of Vietnam. So Johnson administration reported an incoming fire for North Vietnamese ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. A very, very controversial issue. It's one of those like Maine. Remember the Maine, USS Maine during the Spanish-American War. A little incident that was taken probably completely out of proportion and made into a casus belli, or the cause of war. So, that's when the American involvement in Vietnam started. Well, there was an involvement before, except from that point on it was a war. Anyways, we have assassination of Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald. And I don't know, you have a question there about, some biographical information about him. Check that out. Don't buy just into conspiracy theories. And so that's why I'm a little bit afraid of that question. Right, you have the changes even in the Roman Catholic Church, the so-called Second Vatican Council, which basically eliminated Latin as the language of the church and translated the liturgy and the services of the church into vernacular languages, and in our case English. And that was a big deal for a lot of people here in the United States, a lot of Catholics and non-Catholics. So anyways, that's Vatican II, Spirit of the Times, 1960s. We have, right, this Commission on the Status of Women, you'll figure that one out. Racial issues in the United States, including the Chicano movement in the West, in the black community, the division between the moderates, like Martin Luther King, and the radicals like Malcolm X. Nation of Islam and others. What else do we have? Lyndon Johnson, right. Riots in American cities in 1967 and 68. For some reason, all the problems concentrated in the 60s. Students were protesting, black people are protesting, Chicano people are protesting, you name it. Anyways, we have what else? Student protests, right? Student protests. It actually, in the United States, started at Columbia University. There was a, right. There was a, I don't know if you've been to the campus of Columbia University, but it's on Morningside Heights. And it's kind of on the top of the hill. When you come to the Morningside Park, there is a cliff, and you go down. There's very steep stairs that get you down to Harlem. And Columbia University was building a gym on that edge. And the gym had two entrances, one on the top where this Columbia University and one on the Harlem side. And students thought that, this is going to be a segregated facility, for the black people from Harlem and then for the white people on the top from Columbia. So the protest started over there at Columbia University. But it spread all over the United States. A lot of campuses were taken over by students. And not just in the United States. The most famous of these student demonstrations were actually in Paris. One of the complaints was that the classes were too difficult, by the way. That's what we were talking about it. People thought that classes were too difficult, and one of the changes that happened was that professors could appear like in shabby clothes instead of suit and ties, as it was it was required before 1968. So anyways, racial riots, the Civil Rights Act, blah blah. Let's see, what else do we have? Dixiecrats, Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, and a little bit about Bob Dylan. So this is what awaits you tomorrow morning. And well, this is where my talk ends. I wish you the best of luck, and see you tomorrow at our regular meeting at noon, high noon.